Tammy Kolda, an applied mathematician, and this is Unlocking LaTeX Graphics. On this channel, I present tutorials on using TikZ and PGF plots. The videos on this channel are based on my book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics, as well as some bonus materials. Today I'm going to show you how to use TikZ layers. This topic was suggested by a viewer, so a shout out to Sven Win Passinger 2170 for the idea. We previously covered the TikZ backgrounds library, which allows you to create a single background layer, and I'll link to that episode in the show notes. Today we're going to use PGF tools to create multiple layers so we can draw at different levels within our diagram. To illustrate using layers, I'm going to recreate the figure that I'm showing here that has two background layers. This figure comes from the famous Attention is All You Need paper, which introduced the transformer architecture of AI large language models. I linked to that paper in the LaTeX document and in the show notes. This graphic is a good example for layers because there are two layers behind the main layer. So we'll have 3 layers in total. I'll also add a 4th layer in front of the main layer with a copy of the snapshot of the figure we're reproducing so that we can trace its layout. Let's get started. Here's our document setup. I'm using parskip to avoid paragraph indentation and hyperref to link the author name back to this YouTube channel. The main package is TikZ. Today I'm using 3 TikZ libraries: arrows.meta for nicer arrow tips, positioning to place nodes relative to each other, and calc for coordinate arithmetic. I defined 3 HTML colors to match the original picture. I got these HTML codes using a color picker tool on the original image. Now look at the layer setup. By default, TikZ draws everything on a single layer called main, and it does the drawings in source order, meaning that later commands paint over earlier ones. Layers let you control draw order separately from source order. Anything on a layer further down is painted first, so it ends up behind things on later layers. I use PGF declare layer to declare 3 new layers: background 1, background 2, and a ridge. The ridge layer is where I will put a semi-transparent copy of the original image to be traced. There's automatically a layer called main, which is the default for drawing. The PGF layers command here sets the ordering of the layers from back to front. So in our case, I have background 2, background 1, main, and a ridge. Down below, I have a link to the paper that has the image that we're reproducing today. One trick I often use when recreating figures is placing a semi-transparent version of the image I'm trying to recreate and then tracing underneath of it. Here I'm using our first PGF on layer command or environment, and I'm specifying the ridge layer, which is where I'm going to put the graphic. I'm including that graphic as a node inside our TikZ picture. I'm scaling it to 50% because otherwise it's just too big because of the way I copied it. And the main thing here is that I set the opacity of this node to 30% so we can see through it to the drawing that we're creating underneath. Before placing any boxes, I'm going to define a generic box style that sets the node to be drawn. It creates an ultra-thick border and rounded corners, very much like the boxes in the image. The box style takes 3 arguments. Those 3 arguments are going to specify the fill color, the minimum width, and the minimum height. I used this narg syntax to define a style, and I covered that in a prior episode that I'll link in the show notes. The style uses these arguments, as you can see, to set the fill color, the minimum width, and the minimum height. I'm going to use specific heights and widths for each box, which is especially important because I'm going to be drawing boxes in the background that are blank, but I need them to be the same size as the boxes in front. Normally, boxes auto-size to the text that they contain. Instead, I'm going to use these explicit sizes, and I'm going to make sure they're large enough to contain the text. To ensure this, I'm also setting the inner separation to 0. In this way, I'll know that the sizes aren't large enough if any of the text is up against the edge of the box. Also, since I know I'm going to have one multi-line box, I'm setting the align equals center here. You need that to be able to have a carriage return inside of a node. Now let's start to place things. I'm going to drop a placeholder box that's going to be this middle box, scale dot product attention. I'm just going to call it attention for short. I'm using the box style, setting the fill to none, the width to 5 centimeters, and the height to 1 centimeter. This is just a guess. So let's see what happens when I compile. When I compile this, I see two issues. First, the background image is centered at 0, 0, but this doesn't center that attention node at 0, 0, which is what I want. Second, the box that I'm drawing is a little bit too small. I want the center of the attention block in the original image to land at 0, 0, where my placeholder box is. So I'm going to scooch that box a little bit by adding a shift of 3.5 millimeters in the X direction and 1 millimeter in the Y direction. I do a little bit of trial and error until those two boxes are centered with respect to one another. Now I can size the attention block to match the original. After some trial and error, I know that this should be 5.25 centimeters and 1.2 centimeters. And that should get me to the right size. Next, I'm going to go ahead and actually add the text to my block and see what it looks like. Notice that I put in a manual carriage return to split the text in the same way it is in the image that we're copying. Right now, this font is not the right font or the right size, so let's fix this. I'm going to go here to the node options, and I'm going to try the sans serif family and large and see how that looks. That looks much more like the font in our original picture. We won't get an exact match because a totally different program was used to generate it, but this is reasonably close. Next, I already figured out offline the placement and sizes of the other nodes. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste the results here. I start with this concat block, and then I go up and draw this linear box. Then I draw the linear box below, and then I draw the letter K down at the bottom. I'm just doing the center line for now, and right now I just really want to understand the relative spacing. So I control how much it goes above or below using these spacing options. I'm using the positioning library here, and I'll link to my episode on that in the show notes. Now that I have the right font, node sizes, and placements, I'm going to use that information to create some styles that I can reuse to make drawing everything easier rather than repasting all this business every time. So I'm going to go back up here to where I define my TikZ set, and I'm going to paste in a bunch of things. So I'm going to set the node font overall to the SF family and large. Then I'm going to define a style for each type of box. Inside that style definition, I'll call the box style with the color of that box, the size that I figured out from all my calculations. And I also define a special node type called letter below, which is for the letters down here. Note that this style has the positioning below equals 15 millimeters embedded, so I don't have to type it every time. Let me go back here and just show you using the attention style for the first node. Now we have this nice purple thing. Let me turn off the original image for a second, and you can start to see what we have here. You can see that we have our outline set up. I'll do the same with the concat node, and I'm also here going to add an edge to the attention node. Unfortunately, this arrow we just draw, which you can probably barely see, is too skinny and not the right arrowhead. I want all my edges to be ultra thick with a stealth arrow tip on top. That's going to match the original picture. So back inside this TikZ set block, I'm going to specify an edge style for all my edges to be ultra thick and to use the stealth arrowhead. And I'm scaling this down to 70% of its normal size. So now when I compile that, we have these edges that look very much like the edges in the original picture. In the show notes, I'll link to the episode on arrows and edges. Next, I'll redo this top linear node using the style for linear and creating an edge to concat. I'm also creating a funny little edge here that points out to a point 5 millimeters above the north point of that node. I'm using the Y shift syntax to set a target 5 millimeters above LTOP's north anchor, And I'll link to my recent episode about shifting inside a named node reference. Let's do the linear box below attention and the K label below that. I've also included here edge from K to linear. Now I want to add extra linear nodes to the left and right of the middle one. Let me turn back on the original picture so you can see what that's supposed to look like. I already worked out that the right distance between those nodes is 3.5 millimeters. When I go ahead and paste that and compile, we can see that this aligns very nicely with the original image, and the letters are placed relative to the new linear nodes. We're missing the arrows from the 3 lower linear nodes to the attention block. And that's because they're going to have to be handled in a special way. Instead of writing them out, I'm going to use a for each loop over V, K, and Q, and I've named these linear nodes LV, LK, and LQ. Then I'm going to add a little loop here that goes through each of those nodes, draws from LV, for example, an edge that aligns with its center in the X value and attention.south in the Y value. So when I compile that, you can see that we get our 3 arrows. I'll link to the episode on using these so-called corner coordinates in the show notes, since this is an example of that. I'm going to go back up here and turn off the original image again so you can get a sense of what it looks like. Turning off the original image, we see that we have the front layer complete. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on again so we can figure out what our back layers need to look like. Let's do the first background layer. So I'm first going to define a coordinate named shift1, and I'll explain how I use that in a moment. Then I'm going to use the pgfonlayer, and I'm going to use background 1 as my layer. So that's going to draw behind main. I'm also going to use a scope to set the opacity to 66% because it should show up a little bit lighter. I'll start with a copy of the attention block, and I'm just going to name this node as attention 1. And I will note the reason that we had to do this as a background layer is we are placing it relative to something that we put into the foreground. And so we can't draw something behind something that we've already drawn without using layers. So I've started at attention, I've added shift 1, and then I'm placing the new node. Let's see where it ends up. And so if I look at the result here, it's a little bit too close. So I need to take some guessing and refine the shift so that I can get it to the right place. After some trial and error, I find that 0.25 and 0.2 work well to line up with that original picture. So that's going to be my shift for everything in the first background layer. Next, I'm going to add an arrow up to the concat block. This should start at the middle of this attention block and just go to the southern end of concat. So we have to use that corner coordinate calculation again, gets its X value from attention1.center and its Y value from concat.south. Now we have our arrow there. Let's turn off the original image so that we can see things a bit better. I've zoomed in super close here so that you can see that this arrow with opacity 66% looks a little bit funny. There's kind of a little dark region in here. And that has to do with the way the arrow is drawn. There's different things happening and being drawn at different times. And the opacities are sort of overlapping in a way that we don't actually want. We can fix this by adding something called transparency group to our scope options following our opacity command. This causes the whole layer to be composited together before the opacity is applied. So let's take a look at this. We compile and see how it changes. Now it looks much better. No different shadings. It's all the same gray shade, 66%. Now I'm going to add the 3 linear copies on the first background layer using a for each loop over V, K, and Q. So again, I'm using that same shift for each, and when I compile, we see those layers pop up. I'm also making an arrow go to that attention layer in the back. I'm giving each of these the name L, V, for example, and 1. And that's because everything in layer 1 has a 1 following it. I'm showing the original image again. We can see there's a funny little arrow that goes midway up this front arrow and then points to that 1 in back. So we want to recreate that. So the starting point is partway between the north coordinate of the actual letter and the south coordinate of the corresponding linear box. So I'm going to draw from that point to the linear box in the background layer. Let me add that code inside our for each loop. And now we've drawn a little arrow from partway up this edge to that back linear node. Now we have our first background layer complete. The second layer is largely the same, except for some reason the shift is different. And I'm setting the opacity to be 33%. And all the labels are now a 2 instead of a 1. And there we go. Now we have our background layer. So there's a couple more details before we're done. The original figure has this curly sort of brace-looking thing on the right that says H, and that's indicating the number of heads. So let's add that. I've defined here 2 coordinates. Coordinate A is a small shift from the eastmost point of attention 2, and then coordinate B is starting 70% of the way between the northeast point and the southeast point on this eastern edge, and then shifted over by 2 millimeters. The red line sort of shows the 2 points. We'll replace this with the real brace in the next step. Now I'm going to replace the straight red line with a rounded path that looks like a soft bracket. The path is going to go from A out to a point 0.15 to the right and 0.1 below A. That's this coordinate here. Then it's going to create a coordinate midway called C as it's drawing the path. The next stopping point is a point that's a shift from B, the same shift as we just used for A. And then finally, we're going to end at our point B. And I'm using rounded corners to smooth things out. So let's see what happens when we compile that. And we have something that looks very much like that curve. I use this tag in the middle here because that's what I'm going to use to draw this H label next. We're also using here a different syntax for a shifted coordinate. Instead of putting the shift inside the name, I can just use this coordinate calculation way of doing things with dollar signs. There's a lot of different ways you can move coordinates around. Now from this just created coordinate C, I can draw out a short horizontal line segment and put the letter H at the end. And then we've recreated that little part. Let me zoom in here, and we're going to see a little detail that I would like to fix up. We have a little imposition of this black line onto this gray bar. It's actually not there in the original picture. So I'd like to cover that up. And so here I'm just going to draw an ultra thick 33% gray line from a little bit above that point A to a little bit below, and then shifted appropriately. And then when I compile that, now we see that I've covered up where that black is overlapping in a way that I don't like. That's a detail. Most of the time I would not worry about that, but I wanted to look as close to the original image as possible. If you know of a better way to do this, let me know in the comments. Let's look at the original image one more time to see how we're doing. Above the whole figure, I want a title, and that's the only thing missing right now. I'm going to place a note above the current bounding box dot north, which is whatever is currently the topmost extent of the picture and centered left to right. I'm going to compile this, and that title appears, but it appears where I didn't want. It's actually above that picture that I copied in. And that's because that picture is affecting the bounding box. So I'm going to go back up to the top where I have that picture, and I'm going to add the option overlay here. And that's going to say that it doesn't actually affect the bounding box at all. And now we see that those two titles line up. I'll also note that in this title node, I changed the font to just be large and boldface. Now it compiles correctly with the title just above the figure. If you want to know more on bounding boxes, I of course also have an episode on that I'll link in the show notes. So finally, let's turn off the original image one more time, and then we'll see what our final result looks like. I think this looks great. I hope you enjoyed learning about PGF layers and using them to recreate a figure from the Attention is All You Need paper. We used a lot of TikZ skills in this video. I'm not even sure I've captured them all, but we used nodes and edges. We used different methods for positioning, including relative placement using the positioning library, coordinate calculations, and shifting. We also used styles such as fonts, fill colors, line thicknesses, and arrows. And we defined styles, including styles with multiple arguments. We used loops to avoid writing out repetitive code. We learned a new skill of layering via the PGF layer commands. We also learned about the transparency group option to make sure that the opacity applies to a whole scoped layer as a unit. I'll include a link to the overleaf document I created today in the show notes. If you found this helpful or interesting, please click like and subscribe. Today's topic was suggested by a viewer. If you have questions or suggestions for future videos, please post them in the comments. I do read them. If you want to learn more, please check out the other videos. I also have a book, Unlocking LaTeX Graphics, available for purchase at major book retailers. Thanks for watching.